Chapter 17, Section 2, Ideas that Influenced Darwin. Learning objectives. Identify the conclusions drawn by Hutton and Lyell about Earth's history. Describe Lamarck's hypothesis of evolution. Describe Malthus's view of population growth. Explain the role of inherited variation in artificial selection. Darwin was influenced by other scientists' work during one of the most exciting periods in scientific history. Geologists and naturalists were pioneering new ways of thinking about the natural world that guided him as he proposed hypotheses and gathered data to test them. Many different scientists influenced Darwin in his thinking. Many Europeans in Darwin's day thought that the Earth was only a few thousand years old, and that it hadn't changed much since it was formed. But by the time Darwin set sail, geologists James Hutton and Charles Lyell had proposed very different hypotheses, supported by data that they and other scientists had gathered. Hutton and Lyell concluded that the Earth is extremely old and had been changing constantly over time. They also concluded that the same processes that caused global change in the past operated in the present. In 1785, Hutton proposed hypotheses about how geological processes shaped Earth. He recognized connections between what we now call Earth systems processes and geological features. He realized that certain kinds of rocks form from molten lava and other kinds of rocks form slowly, and sediment builds up and are squeezed into layers. He proposed that forces within the Earth can push rock layers upward, tilting, twisting, folding them, and building mountains. Those mountains in turn can be eroded by rain, wind, heat, and freezing. Most of these processes operated very slowly, so for them to have enough time to shape the Earth, our planet must be very old. These data and inferences moved Hutton to introduce the concept of deep time. The idea that Earth's history stretched so far back in time that it is difficult for human minds to imagine. Lyell, who built on the work of Hutton and others, began publishing the Principles of Geology in 1830. He championed the geological doctrine of uniformitarianism, which holds the laws of nature are constant over time. So geological processes we see today are the same processes that have shaped the Earth over millions of years. Ancient volcanoes released lava and gases just as volcanoes do now. Ancient rivers slowly dug channels and carved canyons just as they do today. Lyell's theories required enough time for these changes to occur. Like Hutton, Lyell argued that Earth therefore had to be much older than a few thousand years. Darwin read Lyell's books during his voyage. With Lyell's ideas in mind, Darwin had the good fortune to see a volcano erupt in Chile. He later learned that another volcano 480 miles away had blown its top the same night. A few weeks later, he experienced an earthquake that threw him to the ground and lifted a stretch of rocky shoreline more than 3 meters out of the sea, with mussels and other sea animals clinging to it. Still later, when Darwin traveled inland, he observed beds of fossil marine animals in mountains hundreds of meters above sea level. Those experiences amazed Darwin, who turned out to be smart enough, creative enough, and curious enough to transform his observations into scientific insights. Darwin had begun to make connections between the characteristics and ecology of living things, the characteristics of fossils, and the processes of global systems whose interactions had shaped the living world. These connections would grow and develop into an interdisciplinary science of modern paleontology. Darwin wasn't the first person to suggest that species could evolve. The fossil record already provided strong enough evidence that life had changed over time. Ideas about how species could evolve, however, differed. French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed 2 of the first hypotheses about how species could change over time. Lamarck suggested that individual organisms could change during their lifetime by selectively using or not using various parts of their bodies. He also suggested that individuals could pass these acquired traits on to their offspring, enabling species to change over time. Lamarck published these hypotheses in 1809, the year Darwin was born. Lamarck proposed that all organisms have an inborn urge to become more complex and perfect. As a result, organisms change and acquire features that help them live more successfully in their environment. He thought that organisms could change the size and the shape of their organs by using their bodies in new ways. According to Lamarck, for example, water birds could have acquired long legs because they began to wade in deeper waters looking for food. Lamarck also suggested that if a bird acquired a trait like longer legs during its lifetime, it could pass that trait on to its offspring. This principle is called inherited of acquired trait characteristics. Today we know that Lamarck's hypotheses are completely unsupported. Organisms do not have the inborn drive to become perfect. Evolution does not mean that a species becomes better over time. Also, evolution does not progress in a predetermined direction. We also know that traits acquired by individuals during their lifetime are not passed along in a way that accounts for evolutionary change. Still, Lamarck was one of the first naturalists to argue strongly that species are not fixed. He was among the first to propose a scientific description of natural processes he thought could enable species to change over time. Lamarck also recognized that organisms' adaptations are related to their environment and the way they make a living, so to speak. So, although Lamarck's hypotheses about the mechanism of evolutionary changes were wrong, his ideas paved the way for later biologists, including Darwin. In 1798, English economist Thomas Malthus noted that people were being born faster than people were dying, causing overcrowding. Malthus reasoned that if the human population grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone. The forces that work against population growth include things like war, famine, and disease. Darwin was thunderstruck when he read Malthus's work. He realized that if Malthus' reasoning applied to people, it also applied to other organisms. Why was this realization important? Darwin was convinced that species evolved, but he needed a mechanism, a scientific explanation based on natural processes that could produce evolutionary change. So Darwin did what good scientists do. He asked important questions, such as which individuals survive and why. Darwin combined ideas about population growth with observations that included organisms in nature and how they differed from one another. Farmers also told Darwin that some of these differences were inherited variation, meaning that they could be passed from parents to offspring. Farmers used this variation to their advantage. They would select for breeding only trees that produced the largest fruit, or cows that produced the most milk. Over time, this selective breeding, which Darwin called artificial selection, would produce trees with even bigger fruit and cows that gave more milk. In artificial selection, nature provides the inherited variation, and humans select those varieties they find useful. Darwin tested artificial selection himself by breeding plants and fancy pigeon varieties. Darwin had no idea how heredity worked or what caused inherited variation, but he did know that inherited variation occurs in wild species as well as in domesticated plants and animals. Finally, Darwin had all the information he needed. His scientific explanation for evolution was formed. When it was published, it would change the way people understood the living world.